All right, so let's get building this Snow Trax TT-02B buggy. We're going to start off with bag A, and then next video we'll do bag B, so on and so forth. So a little tip to make your building easier. I don't know if I've suggested this in previous videos, but if you leave them in the bags, it will keep any little pieces that have maybe broken off the sprue in together. I used to take everything all out of the bag and then start my build, and I learned that keeping them in the bag and just labeling the bag with a Sharpie makes things a lot easier to find, and any little pieces that may have broken off the sprue in transit don't get lost. That's a little tip from me to you. So step one, I'm just going to flip through my steps here. So step one is building the differentials and the drivetrain. So we start off with that, and I know that I said in the unboxing, and you can see in the upper right hand corner here, that the MS kit comes with shielded ball bearings, which is beautiful. It's wonderful that it comes with ball bearings, but this is going to be a hard use, muddy use, snowy, slushy use rig. So I'm choosing to use rubber shielded bearings on any outward facing surfaces so that they don't get full of dirt and grit and grime. So I went ahead and bought a Fast Eddies bearing kit. This is the part number for Fast Eddies, and this is what it comes with. So you'll see that some places I use metal shielded and some places I use rubber shielded, and any place that's going to be sealed up or fairly protected from elements, I'm going to use the metal shielded, but every place else I'm going to try to use rubber shielded bearings. So when you're building this up, you just slide all the parts together, and this outside part here, because the drive shaft is inside the chassis, it gets pretty grubby. That one gets a rubber shielded bearing. And then this is the inside part of the shaft that's protected by the covers, so I went ahead and used metal shielded. The reason that I don't use rubber shielded all the way through is metal shielded actually has less friction. Rubber shielded gives a better seal, protects the bearings from getting dirt and grime infused, but the metal shielded runs a little bit smoother, so I try to do it this way when I'm in a harsh environment. Otherwise, metal shielded is the way to go. And this is what it looks like when it's all built up. So we got our bevel gear here, metal shielded here, rubber shielded here. It all lines up. One tricky part about this part of the build is there's a little cross pin that fits in this collar here. Make sure that when you're putting it together, that metal cross pin sits in the there's a little resting spot. It looks like a cross that is inside this collar. So when you're putting it together, make sure that it hasn't twisted or locked, misaligned, so that that collar is resting on that cross pin. That's a little tip. And then this is what the other end looks like. So both of these are, I use rubber shielded because even though there's a plastic cover, it's just a holding piece. It's not really a sealing out piece. And this thing clamps down over, but this side of the bearing is exposed to the elements. Both sides of this bearing are exposed to the elements, so that's why I'm using rubber shielded on both of these ends. I don't know if you can see in here, there's a rubber O-ring, and that's true on both sides because this aluminum drive shaft and these drive cups here, the manual here in step 2 calls for you to put this together. And what I'll do is I'll put a little bit of AW grease to hold this rubber bearing in the appropriate position and have it slide down a little bit better. I don't like using a lot of grease in rigs that I know are going to be in dirt and grime and grit because the grease will attract the dirt and then it will turn it into an abrasive paste. So I only use just the smallest amount of AW grease to keep that rubber O-ring in position while it's being inserted into the cup. The rubber O-ring is important because it acts as a spacer, because this shaft is a slightly different length and metal against metal is bad, so it acts as a cushion. So you got to make sure you include both on both ends and only use the smallest amount of anti-wear grease when you're putting it together. So Step 3 is putting that retention collar here in the front of the chassis. So you'll notice that I'm using hex head stainless steel screws. And again, that's a hop-up that I've chosen to use because I know this is going to be used in harsh conditions, especially here in the wintertime. They use salt on the roads, and it would end up rusting super fast if I use the stock screws from the kit. So I went ahead and invested in a box of RC screws, stainless steel screws. This is the part number here. This is what it all comes with, but pretty much the reason being is the M3 screws bite better into the plastic than the self-tappers that come with the kit. They're a much finer thread. They seem to hold better as long as you don't over-tighten. They're easier to over-tighten, which is one of the reasons why I think Tamiya probably includes those self-tappers with the kit, because this is a beginner kit. So if you're a stark beginner, go ahead and use the kit screws. You don't need to invest 50 bucks, but if you want to have a little bit better of a constructed kit, the metric screws with the stainless steel is great. You can get titanium if you want to really blow money on a TT-02. I guess that's your call if you've got the extra cash to spend, but you don't need titanium. Just go with stainless steel and you'll be all good to go. So building up the diffs, this is step 4. Now, when you're racing, you want to use different viscosity oil inside your diff to tune your diff action. Well, normally when I build a TT-02, I'll just pack the front diff with as full of anti-wear grease as I can make it, just jam it packed full. And then the rear diff, I'll use Cera grease or something like that, or use just a coating of anti-wear grease to make the back diff a little bit looser. That should give a little bit better handling for on-road cars and stuff. I'm going to go ahead and build this one up with a similar thought, where there's a slightly stiffer diff action in the front, particularly because four-wheel drive, these big tracks are going to, I think, need a little bit more stiffer diff, that's not smart, a stiffer diff in the front to get good turning, and it will help pull through corners. So because I wanted to tune this and have control over how much diff action there was, for most bashers, even fun racers and stuff, the anti-wear grease is wonderful. You don't need anything more than that for most cases. I went a little overboard on this and I went ahead and tuned it. So the front, it's getting 5,000 weight, and the rear is getting 3,000 weight. So this is the Kyosho gear, diff gear grease, and these are the part numbers for that over here. So when you build it up, I use, actually, I stole this from my kids' art kit. They have a lot of these. This is a spatula for painting. So it's a tiny little cheap, came from Michael's in a kit, whatever. So I stole this little thing here, and it works great as a spatula. You could also probably use a plastic knife to do the same deal. I put just enough grease on the back facing here to give it some lubrication against the plastic. So when I drop that bevel gear into the diff housing, that back side here has some lubrication. Also acts as a good seal to keep any dirt from getting into the diff gears themselves. Then I put a good healthy amount of diff gear grease. I just take the scooper and I put a little blob on all 4 corners, and it sort of works its way down. Then I build up the spider gear here in the center, and then I put them down in, and then I just jam pack all of the grease. Now when you put the spider gear in, you know you've put enough grease underneath the spider gear when you see the grease squeeze up around the gears as you push the spider gear down. Then you should have to blob on a little bit more on the top, and I like to get it totally filled to the very brim. So then I take the edge of the spatula thing and I scrape off any extra so it's not domed over, because it's going to dome up when you push the other bevel gear in. So as long as I see the grease has squeezed out around the outside edges, then again I take the spatula and I scrape off any excess diff grease that has squeezed out from around the bevel gear, as you can see here in this picture. So it's all scraped off, and I get my ring gear here, and then I screw it down again using the stainless steel hex head screws. In the kit, please note, these screws are 1mm hex. 1mm hex is extremely weird. It's a very strange size. The only other thing in this entire kit that I know of that could use a 1mm hex wrench is the grub screw for the pinion. So, wicked small. Pain in the butt to do. Probably overkill using stainless steel hex head screws, given that the 1mm hex head fitting here. Just using the JIS head screws that come with the kit, because the screwdriver, if you've got the Tamiya kit, any one of the Tamiya screwdrivers that are JIS have a much bigger handle. It'd be a lot easier to screw this in. Just make sure that when you screw it down in, you screw it snug but not over tightened, because the last thing you want these doing is stripping this plastic out with over tightening these screws. Then when you're all done, go ahead and get a paint marker. I've got these Gundam markers, and I write on the diff, something I brought over from racing, is writing what the weight of the oil is, or the gear grease is inside the diff. That way when I take it apart in the future, a couple years down the line, who knows, maybe I'll never take it apart, but I'll at least know what's in there. So that's what my recommendation. Get a Sharpie if you want. I like a paint marker. They're a little bit more permanent. Then write down what you put in. So if it's anti-wear, put an AW. If it's weighted, put down the weight. If it's just Ceragrease, put CG for Ceragrease. And again, because these are outward facing, these are going to be exposed to the elements, probably some of the most exposure of all of the bearings. This is the inside of the drive shaft where it's going to connect into. Again, rubber shielded bearings instead of the kit supplied metal shielded bearings. Not that these are terrible to use, you're just going to end up having to clean them out a lot more. And then the front, again, like I said, we got 5,000 in the front. Now, in the manual, it looks like the ring gears are both on the bottom side. It's tricky because in the manual what they do is they actually rotate the chassis. So if you leave the chassis on your bench when you're working on it, and you've got the rear on the left, and you put the ring gear on the near side of you, on the front end, the ring gear needs to be on the far side of you, as I've shown here in the picture. This is gear on the far side. I guess I went back too far. Oh, it's forward. This is ring gear on the near side, ring gear on the far side, because the chassis is facing the same direction. Right? You see, this is the front of the chassis pointed to the right. Ring gear is on the back side. This is still the chassis with the nose pointing to the right, which means this gear, the ring gear, has to be on the near side. If we don't have the ring gears on opposite sides of each other, the wheels will work against each other and the car will go nowhere. It'll just sit there and shake, and depending upon how much traction the tires get, you might even cause some damage. So you always want to ensure that your ring gears are opposite of each other. I should have taken a picture of the entire chassis with these covers off, but I didn't do it. I'm sorry. So 3K in the back, ring gear near side with the nose pointing to the right, and front of the chassis, nose pointed to the right, and the ring gear is on the opposite side. Okay, hope I beat that one to death, but I've seen so many people build these cars and they end up putting the ring gear both on the near side or both on the far side because they don't rotate the chassis, and the manual doesn't state that they're rotating the chassis. The pictures are drawn such that if you're paying very close attention, you'll notice that they rotate the chassis. They just don't say it, and when you're building, it's really easy to overlook. Okay, moving on to Step 7, motor. As I said in the unboxing, I went ahead and I'm going to give this motor a try. I wanted to stick with brush motors because brush motors are weatherproof, a lot more so than a brushless motor. And I know you can get a uncensored brushless motor. It'd be crazy torquey, but you won't have nearly the control at slow speeds. So brush motors, they're very cheap, although this one not so much. As I went and found the part numbers and stuff, I don't remember how much I paid for it. It's been a couple years since I bought all these parts, but this is looking like it's going for about $60 right now, which Tamiya motors are always more expensive anyways. But still, you could probably use the stock torque tuned motor that comes with the kit. And I understand that this one is also called torque tuned, but it's a TR, truck torque tuned, so it's different. The stock torque tune is a 27 turn, okay, and this one is a 33 turn, so it's a higher turn, which means a little more torque, than even the stock motor that's called the torque tune motor. This one is nice because it has a much nicer end bell. It also has ball bearings in it, where the stock torque tuned, the 27 turn version, is bushed, and it's basically run it till it dies, which could be an extremely long time when those motors are bulletproof. But this is just a little bit nicer of a motor. It should be more efficient, a little bit more torquey. Also gives you a little bit longer run time, which is always nice. And I don't expect to want this rig to be a speed demon, although I might change my mind and switch out the motors in the future. I don't know. This is what we're going to start with. So as you can see, I put the specs over on the left so you can see what the RPMs are, what the input voltages are, what the torques are, and what the part number is if this is something you want to go with. Other people have said that they use it in the CR1s, rock crawlers and stuff. I think it's going to work out great. We'll see when we get the runtime in, but this is what I decided to go with. And of course, in almost all my builds, I use aluminum motor mounts. Plastic motor mounts are fine for average, regular, everyday running, but with the torque and the weight that these tracks are going to be, I wanted to have the motor mount be as sturdy as possible. So I went ahead and went with the aluminum motor mount. And of course, the nice thing with the aluminum motor mount is in addition to being more robust, it also has a lot more mounting points for different motors. So you go 16 to 20 on this side, and then if you flip it over, there's even higher numbers for that motor mount to go. Now, I know that I said in the unboxing that I was going to use a 20-turn hard-coated aluminum pinion, and I've changed my mind because opening up the kit, going through the parts bag, I noticed that the 17 pinion is a black anodized metal. It feels heavier than aluminum. I'm going to guess that it is a steel, but I can't find any specs on it anywhere. So everything I come up with, it just says it's the stock pinion for this run of cars. So it feels heavier than aluminum, and it's black. All the regular aluminum pinions that I've ever seen from Tamiya are shiny silver aluminum. Even the hardened coated one is shiny silver aluminum. So the fact that this one is black, it looks like all the steel Robinson Racing ones that I've got. I'm going to go with it. This is probably a steel pinion, which in conjunction with the 17 tooth, it'll give me a little bit more torque even still. Maybe I'll switch it out in the future, but we're going to go with the stock one to begin with. Now, this paper donut. This paper donut, I don't know why they recommend using it with the aluminum motor mount. Paper donut is to act as a thermal barrier from a hot motor on a plastic motor mount to keep it from softening, weakening, or even somewhat melting the plastic motor mount, depending on how hot that motor gets. I don't know how much a paper donut like this is going to keep heat from melting plastic, but it's certainly better than not having it. Now, that said, this is aluminum. It's not going to melt, and in fact, the aluminum can help act as a heat sink a little bit. So whenever I use an aluminum motor mount, I never use the paper donut that comes with. I'd considered replacing the stock screws, which are JIS head rather than a hex head, for the screws that go into the motor. And I changed my mind, and I went ahead and used the stock ones, as you'll see here, because I figure the threads and the length are paired up for the motor. So I think it's probably a little bit better of a match. Now, some people I know will put thread lock, blue thread lock on screws going into the motor, and even put blue thread lock onto the grub screw. I don't recommend using thread lock anywhere these places. If you get the torque correct when you're tightening it, don't over tighten it, don't under tighten it. Tighten it until it just feels snug, and then a tiny little bit more, and you're good to go. Same thing with the grub screw. As long as you've got the grub right on the flat spot of the drive shaft, and you get the torque down till it feels snug, then just a tiny little bit more. I've never had a grub screw back out on me. If you use thread lock, trying to get that grub screw out, I've seen more people strip their grub screws and hose a motor because they can't get the grub screw out. Don't bother with the thread lock. It's just not worth the hassle in the long run. It's very easy to pop the cap off and pop this motor out. It's 6 screws and maybe 2 minutes to tighten down loose motors. So, and the same thing with the grub screw. If it does loosen up on you, it only takes a couple of minutes to tighten it, to pop it out, tighten it down. You don't even have to pull the motor out. You just have to pop 4 screws and pop the cap off to tighten the grub screw down. So I'd recommend not using thread lock on motor screws or grub screw for the pinion. This is what it looks like when it's mounted into the chassis. What I do is align the pinion so it's sitting nice dead center in the spur gear, and I orient the grub so it's sitting straight up and down, so that I can back it off just a touch, move this back and forth until I get it as centered as I possibly can, and then snug it down while it's inside the motor like this. Finally, mounting the motor into the chassis. Okay, so after I get the pinion adjusted to where I like the positioning of it, I go ahead and pop it back out. And I like to use this Tamiya anaerobic gel thread lock. It's a thicker viscosity than, say, a blue thread lock. I have blue thread lock and I use it in certain instances, but things like this, I like the gel because I use I clip a small zip tie, maybe a 1mm zip tie width, and I use that as a little applicator, and I dig just a tiny little bit out, put it into the screw holes, and then I scrape off as much as I can, and then I wipe it off with a paper towel so that there's no thread lock on the mounting surfaces here. It's important because while this will help keep metal to metal surfaces, metal screw into metal motor mount from backing out once it dries up, and it doesn't fully dry. That's kind of the neat thing about this gel, is it doesn't fully harden like a glue does or the way the blue thread lock does. It stays kind of gummy, makes removing a little bit easier. It doesn't vibrate out as much. At any rate, it's bad for plastic. So if you smear it on, or if you put it on the threads like you will do with blue thread lock, you'll put a tiny little drop on the thread, it'll work its way down into the threads, and then you screw it in. Okay, that's all well and good. This, I can put it into the screw hole, scrape it off, it stays there, no thread lock on it to touch the plastic, which will then weaken the plastic. Now, when I first put it in, I put it in so that the label was facing up. Looks pretty. However, when I did that, the wires for the motor were on the inside. They weren't touching the drive shaft, but they were close, and I didn't care for that. So I went ahead and disassembled everything and remounted the motor in 180 degrees so that the wires were on the outside of the motor, not the inside, so that I don't have as likely of a chance of having any interference with motor wires running into the drive shaft. Now, a little tip from me to you. These are some two 12mm and the rest are 10mm hex heads. Discerning the difference between a 10 and a 12, unless you do this, can be extremely tricky. I have grabbed 8s instead of 12s, and 10s instead of 12s, and 12s instead of 10s. If I do this, I just stand them all up on end. It's very easy to see which ones are which. So, a little tip from me to you, trying to discern which screws are what length. Yes, I know that the manuals are drawn to scale and you can set the screw down on the paper, but if you stand them all up like this, it makes finding them a whole lot easier and saves you time and headaches. Screwing in a shorter screw than what's called for gives you not as strong of a connection. Screwing in a longer screw than what's called for oftentimes doesn't allow you to get it all the way tight, or it strips out the threads because there isn't enough plastic depth to where you're screwing the screw into. All right, moving on to step 9. So when you cut the suspension arms from the sprue, even though I'm using the Tamiya fine-tipped trimmers, right? It does a wonderful job. There's still oftentimes, a little bit of plastic protrusion. And on the inside of the suspension arm like so, that will cause friction and it will give you a less smooth working suspension arm. And you want your suspension arms to flop just like crazy. The suspension shocks will keep the motion in check, but you want the arms themselves to have free motion, and these little plateaus of plastic will mess that up. So I've got a set of Tamiya basic files. I think that for this exact purpose, a sponge sanding block would work even better, but use whatever you've got. Some people will use an X-Acto knife and shave that off. It's a little dangerous, I think. Also doesn't give quite as rounded of a shape, it becomes more of a polygon. However, this is what I use. I've got these files. One is totally flat, one is a half round, the other one is a rat tail. And this is the part number for that over here if you wanted to get a set for yourself. And this is what it ends up looking like. It looks a little chewed up, yes, because I've got the medium teeth instead of the fine teeth. I think if I were buying again, I'd probably get the fine tooth files. However, it's pretty well rounded, and it doesn't matter if it looks scratchy. It's that ridge, that plateau of plastic is now gone. Now, putting this together is a little tricky because the retaining U-shaped pin has to go through this retention block, then into the chassis itself, and then through the suspension arm, and then into the chassis here, and there's little collars that you have to put in. You'll see those in the directions. It's just tricky, and be patient with yourself putting this together if this is the first time doing it. Run it through this collar first, and then line up the arms. I find that it might sometimes be easier turning the chassis up on end so that you're putting the U-shaped retention pin in vertically from the top rather than on the table trying to put it in from the side. At any rate, this is kind of how it lays out. Throughout this build, I try to tell you what tools and stuff I'm using if they're unique, and this is just a electric screwdriver that I happened to pull off of Amazon a couple years ago. I think it was 20 bucks. I don't know what it is now or if it's even still available, this exact model, but it's called an Abden. It's got a lithium ion built-in charger thing. This is the part number here. The hex head screws did not come with the kit. It comes with a lot of different bits. They're all very cheap. I don't recommend using them for any precision work. And I had to get an extra set of bits here to fit in so that I could have metric tips. They're really hard to find, metric tips. And I think I got these off of A-Main. If anybody's interested, I can go look up the part number. I'm usually pretty good about that, but I just forgot to do that for this one. At any rate, this is a screwdriver. Now, all electric screwdrivers have a ratchet. I put this one on ratchet level 1. And it works great for hard plastics. However, it's still too harsh for softer plastics, and Tamiya uses a lot of softer plastics, especially on this kit, because soft plastics will bend and flex, take less damage when beginners are driving them. So whenever you're using an electric screwdriver, 2 tips for you. 1, don't screw the entire length of the screw in one shot. As you're turning it, the plastics, if you're turning it by hand, they will get warm. But when you're turning it with a power tool, it gets really warm, and it will actually melt the plastic as the screw cuts its thread. So I'd recommend going no more than halfway and then rotating around as you go down. So go halfway, all the way around, however many screws you're doing in that step, and then go halfway again, all the way around. So you'll end up doing it in 3 stages. Halfway, 3/4 of the way, then all the way down. And if you're into anything but the most firm plastics, don't let the ratchet be your stopping point. Go all the way down until you can just barely see some daylight to where the screw head is almost touching the plastic surface. Then get your screwdriver out and tighten it down the rest of the way by hand. Little tip. Okay, now this is step 11, which is the front suspension arms. Okay, and they say to put some anti-wear grease on this little guide collar here. The guide collar is to keep the U-shaped retention pin from being sloppy. It doesn't really need to slide up and down. The anti-wear grease is there to act as sort of a pseudo-adhesive to keep that guide from falling out of the plastic. So as you can see, I put just the tiniest little amount in there using a Q-tip so that it stays where it needs to be while I'm trying to finagle that U-shaped retention pin in. So in step 11, you'll see where they say to put a little bit of anti-wear grease on there. This is how much you need to use. And again, just be really careful when you're putting that U-shaped pin in that these things don't go flying, that the U-shaped pin actually goes through them. It's a little tricky of a step. And this is what this looks like when it's all finished up through bag A. We've got our front and rear suspension arms on. We've got our diffs built together. We've got the ring gears on opposite sides, so the ring gear back here is near, the ring gear back here is far, I believe is how we did it. We've got our hex head stainless steel screws so this doesn't get rusty as we use it in the winter time, and we've got our truck TR torque-tuned motor with the wires facing away from the center line to keep them as far away from the drive shaft as possible. So the next video we'll be working on bag B, which looks like it's suspension bits, more drive. So we got drive axles, and we've got uprights, and we've got, it looks like shocks, steering. Yeah. So the next bag B, is the remainder of the suspension, the remainder of the drivetrain, and that's pretty much, the steering. So suspension, shocks, that's suspension, steering. All right. Anyways, bag A is done. And when the next video comes out, maybe tomorrow or the next day, we'll have bag B done. So again, hope you liked the video. If you do, please leave a like. If you've got any questions, go ahead and leave comments below, and I will answer them as best as I can.